What happens when a racist cop crosses the line and slaps a woman, only to discover that she's not just any woman? Turns out, she's the chief of police, and now he's about to face the consequences of his actions in a way he never expected. This isn't just about a slap. This is about power, prejudice, and the shocking revelation that no one saw coming. How will this encounter change everything for the cop? Stay tuned, because this story goes from shocking to absolutely jaw-dropping. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe how this one ends. Chief Karen Johnson is a woman you don't mess with. Not only is she the chief of police in a bustling city, but she's also spent years fighting for justice and equality. Her reputation precedes her. She's a trailblazer who has worked her way to the top of a male-dominated field, and she's not afraid to speak up against injustice. Behind the badges and the uniforms, Chief Johnson is a compassionate leader who has always believed in the power of kindness and fairness, even when others didn't. Then there's Officer James Carter, a man whose beliefs and actions will soon turn his world upside down. Officer Carter has been working in law enforcement for years, but despite his long tenure, he has one major flaw: his deep-seated prejudice. He's the kind of cop who thinks he knows it all, but his perspective is clouded by racism. Carter believes he can treat people however he likes because he's wearing a badge. He doesn't see the harm in his words or actions. But today, he's about to meet someone who will challenge everything he thinks he knows. The scene is set in a busy, crowded downtown area. Chief Johnson is walking down the street on her way to a local community event when she spots Officer Carter near a routine traffic stop. Everything seems normal at first, until things take an unexpected turn. The officer pulls over a car, but the interaction isn't as routine as it seems. As the situation unfolds, Chief Johnson steps in, only to face the most unexpected confrontation of her life. The street was busy, people walking by, and the hum of the city filled the air. Chief Karen Johnson had just finished a meeting and was walking to her car when she saw Officer James Carter with his lights flashing, pulled over to the side of the road. At first, it looked like just another routine traffic stop. She wasn't in a rush, so she decided to walk by and keep an eye on the situation. But then, something caught her attention. A young black woman was sitting in the car, looking nervous. Carter seemed to be raising his voice at her, not in a calm or controlled manner, but with a tone that suggested he was more interested in being dominant than helping. Chief Johnson could feel her frustration rising. She didn't know exactly what was going on yet, but she didn't like what she was seeing. She approached, and at that moment, the officer turned to her with a sharp glare. "Can I help you?" he asked, almost annoyed that she dared to approach. "I'm Chief Karen Johnson," she replied, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'm just making sure everything's all right here." Carter scoffed. "It's under control, Chief. I'm handling this." He was clearly uncomfortable now, as if being watched by someone of her position made him nervous. Chief Johnson's eyes never left the young woman in the car. She could see the fear in the woman's eyes, and that's when she knew something was wrong. "I don't think you are," she said softly, her voice unwavering. The situation escalated quickly. The officer didn't like being questioned, and his pride quickly took over. He raised his voice at the woman again, calling her names and accusing her of things she hadn't done. "You think you're too good for this, huh?" he shouted. "You people act like you're above the law." The words cut through the air like a knife. The young woman looked terrified, her face pale, and she trembled. Chief Johnson felt her stomach drop. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was happening right in front of her eyes, and this wasn't just a bad day for the young woman. It was a reflection of everything that was wrong with the system. Before she could respond, Carter's anger flared even more. He stepped closer to the car, his fists clenched, and suddenly, without warning, he slapped the woman in the face. The street fell silent. People gasped, and Chief Johnson stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. In an instant, everything changed. She had to act. "Did you just slap her?" Chief Johnson asked, her voice now low and full of authority. Carter turned to her, his face red with anger. "Yes, I did. And if you have a problem with it, I don't care." The crowd around them began to murmur, some people whispering in disbelief. Chief Johnson's anger started to boil over. This wasn't just about the slap. This was about the systemic racism that still infected law enforcement, and it wasn't something she was going to let slide. "You are out of line, officer," she said firmly, stepping forward. "You've just assaulted this woman, and I'm not letting you get away with it." The words were sharp, and she could feel the power of her position rising, but also the weight of what was about to unfold. Carter stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're the chief?" he stammered. "I didn't know." "Yeah," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Now you do." She could feel the tension mounting between them. The crowd had gone silent, watching the confrontation unfold. People were whispering, some recording with their phones, but Chief Johnson didn't care. This wasn't about the crowd. This was about holding Carter accountable for his actions. Carter stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. But Chief Johnson didn't wait for him to make a move. She pulled out her phone and called for backup, her voice steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. "This is Chief Johnson. I need an officer here immediately. Officer Carter needs to be detained." The world seemed to slow down as Carter realized what was happening. The fear started to show in his face. He wasn't the big man anymore. He wasn't in control. Chief Johnson was. Carter stammered, trying to apologize. I didn't mean to," but it was too late. "No," Chief Johnson said firmly. "You don't get to apologize now. You've crossed a line." She turned to the crowd, making sure they knew the severity of the situation. "This is the kind of abuse of power that we're fighting against. I won't stand by while this happens." Within minutes, the backup arrived. Carter was placed in handcuffs and led away, his face red with shame. The crowd that had gathered seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The situation that had started so wrong had been corrected in the most powerful way possible. But Chief Johnson wasn't done. She turned to the woman, who was still sitting in the car, shaken. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softening. The young woman nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Chief," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Chief Johnson smiled and helped her out of the car. "No one deserves to be treated like that," she said. "Not on my watch." The silence in the street was deafening as Chief Karen Johnson stood face to face with Officer James Carter. The slap had landed, and the whole crowd had stopped dead in its tracks, unsure of what to do next. The situation had gone from a simple traffic stop to a full-blown public crisis in the blink of an eye. Carter's face was still flushed with anger, his hand still hovering, as if he hadn't realized what he had just done. He looked around, seeing the crowd gathering, all eyes on him, and his arrogance crumbled. "Did you just slap her?" Chief Johnson's voice was cold, cutting through the tense air. Carter looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and defiance. "Yeah, I did. What are you going to do about it?" He sneered, assuming his badge would protect him from any consequences. The words hit Chief Johnson hard. This wasn't just about an officer's arrogance. It was about a man abusing his power in a way that could have dangerous consequences for the people he was meant to protect. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady, almost unnervingly calm. "What I'm going to do," she said firmly, "is hold you accountable." The crowd around them started to murmur, the tension growing thick. It was clear now that this wasn't a simple argument or misunderstanding. It was about right and wrong, about justice and abuse of power. Carter scoffed, his expression full of defiance. "You think you can tell me what to do? I'm a cop," he yelled, his voice growing louder. "You're nothing but a woman who thinks she can run this place." "Well, guess what? You can't." Chief Johnson stepped forward, her expression hardening as she stood face to face with him. "I am the chief of police, and I'm holding you accountable for your actions." Her voice rang with authority. "You just assaulted a civilian. That's not just a breach of protocol. It's a crime." Carter froze. The realization hit him that he had just stepped way over the line. His hand trembled slightly, and for the first time he understood the weight of what he had done. But his pride wasn't ready to break just yet. "You're just trying to make me look bad." He tried to reason, but it sounded weak even to him. "This is all just a misunderstanding." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Whispers spread through the bystanders. People were starting to take sides. Some were whispering to each other, while others were recording the entire scene on their phones. No one could believe what they were seeing. A police officer behaving like this, in front of the chief of police, no less. Chief Johnson, without hesitation, pulled out her phone and dialed for backup. The sound of the police dispatcher coming through the line was all but a formality. Everyone knew what was about to happen next. While waiting for backup to arrive, Chief Johnson spoke again, her voice steady. "I'm not just going to arrest you, Carter. This is about something bigger. It's about holding people accountable for the choices they make. No one is above the law, not you, not me, not anyone." Her words were clear, and the reality of the situation started to sink in. Carter began to lose the bravado he had displayed moments ago. For the first time, he looked vulnerable. His hands were shaking, and his earlier arrogance had turned into frustration. His face was pale. The moment he realized she was right, his posture sagged, his defiance melting into self-doubt. "You can't do this," Carter muttered under his breath. But it was too late. His actions had already made this confrontation inevitable. The crowd had witnessed it all, and there was no way to reverse it. A few minutes later, backup arrived. Officers stepped in, and Carter was placed under arrest. The realization of what he had done hit him even harder as the officers placed handcuffs on him. The crowd watched, some cheering, some quietly observing, but everyone had witnessed an officer's fall from grace. Carter, the man who thought his uniform made him untouchable, was now just another man facing consequences for his actions. As Carter was led away, Chief Johnson turned to the crowd, her voice carrying over the street. "This is what accountability looks like. This is the kind of thing we need to root out from our system." Her words were strong, and they carried weight. The crowd began to clap, slowly at first, but as the message settled in, the applause grew louder. Chief Johnson wasn't just standing up for one woman. She was standing up for an entire system that had failed to hold some officers accountable for far too long. She turned to the young woman, still sitting in the car, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you okay?" Chief Johnson asked, her tone softening. The young woman nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know who to turn to." Chief Johnson smiled gently and helped the woman out of the car. No one should have to face this alone. As the police van pulled away with Carter inside, Chief Johnson took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over, but today she'd taken the first step in making her department better. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about fighting against the system that allowed this behavior to exist unchecked for too long. After the arrest, everything seemed like it was falling into place. Chief Karen Johnson had stood up for what was right, and Officer Carter had been held accountable for his actions. The crowd around them had seen it all unfold, and many were even applauding the bold decision Johnson had made to take immediate action. But then, just when it seemed like the story was winding down, something completely unexpected happened. A new piece of information came to light that changed the entire narrative, something nobody saw coming. In the following days, the news began to circulate that Carter's behavior wasn't a one-time mistake. In fact, it wasn't even the first time he had faced allegations of racism. Investigations revealed that Carter's history was far darker than anyone had known. Several complaints had been filed against him over the years, but somehow they had all been ignored. A report surfaced showing that he had been involved in several incidents where he had racially profiled individuals, used excessive force during traffic stops, and had made several inappropriate comments about minority communities. His actions had been covered up by higher-ups, and Carter had continued to wear his badge despite his unprofessional behavior. The deeper the investigation went, the more people in the department were implicated, leading to a chain reaction of accountability that no one could have anticipated. This wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about the system he had been working in, one that allowed racism to fester and unchecked power to run rampant. As more officers were questioned, more corruption was uncovered. Johnson's confrontation had started a domino effect, forcing everyone in the department to reckon with their own failures and biases. But here's where the twist gets even more shocking. Chief Johnson wasn't just taking action as a leader. The investigation revealed that she herself had been part of a more significant internal struggle for months, quietly trying to bring about change from within. She had known about the deeper issues within the department long before Carter's outburst, but she had been carefully plotting her next moves. When the story of Carter's arrest broke, it wasn't just the public that was watching. The department's higher-ups were scrambling to protect themselves, knowing that they too had ignored complaints and failed to properly address these issues for years. Chief Johnson had set a trap, knowing full well that Carter's actions would expose everything that was wrong within the system. The twist wasn't just that Carter was a racist cop. It was that Chief Johnson had known all along that the corruption ran much deeper. She had made sure that this was the moment when everything would be exposed. As the story made national headlines, people started questioning everything. Was this just an isolated incident? Or was this a symptom of a larger problem in the country's police departments? Chief Johnson had become a symbol of change, not just for the city, but for a nation grappling with issues of race and policing. Now, everyone was asking one question: what happens next? The department was in turmoil. Carter's arrest was just the beginning of a full-blown overhaul that would require major reforms in law enforcement. Chief Johnson's courage to stand up in the face of such corruption had made her a hero, but it had also made her a target. there were powerful forces within the department who wanted to keep the status quo. Would she survive the political fallout? Would her fight for justice cause even more tension within the department? Or would this lead to the most significant shift in policing that the city and the country had ever seen? As the weeks passed, the effects of the twist were felt everywhere. New measures were put in place, and Chief Johnson was hailed as a leader who wasn't afraid to make enemies in the fight for justice. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but the lesson from the confrontation with Officer Carter had been clear. You have to face the uncomfortable truths in order to make lasting change. The system wasn't going to fix itself on its own, and it was up to people like her to ensure that the future would be different. This was just the beginning of the journey. But the twist, the revelation that the corruption had been so widespread, hidden for so long, shocked everyone. Chief Johnson had not only exposed one officer's actions, but had unearthed a whole web of systemic failure that had been allowed to continue for far too long. The day after the investigation broke, the city was buzzing. Headlines screamed about the shocking events that had unfolded on that busy street. Chief Karen Johnson's bold actions had not only exposed one officer's deep-seated racism, but had sparked a reckoning within the entire police department. What had started as a routine traffic stop had grown into a full-blown crisis, shaking the community to its core. But this wasn't just about Officer Carter's actions anymore. It was about something much bigger: the systemic problems within law enforcement. The days following the investigation were filled with tense moments and difficult decisions. Chief Johnson was now at the center of a storm, and not everyone in the department was happy about the attention her actions had attracted. Some higher-ups in the force, who had been covering up mistakes for years, were furious that their dirty laundry was being aired out for everyone to see. But Johnson remained calm. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that this was the only way to move forward. As the public learned about the truth of what had been happening in the department, many people, including activists and citizens, began to rally behind Johnson. They praised her for having the courage to stand up to a system that had long turned a blind eye to the behavior of some officers. But Johnson knew this was only the beginning. The real work was just starting. There were calls for reform, not just in the city's police department, but in departments nationwide. The situation with Officer Carter was a microcosm of a much larger issue: racism within law enforcement. The more the investigation uncovered, the more people began to understand that this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a culture of impunity, one where officers were allowed to get away with discrimination, brutality, and prejudice without fear of repercussion. For Chief Johnson, it was deeply personal. She had spent her career fighting for fairness and justice, and now she was standing at the crossroads of something bigger than herself. Her actions had opened the door for real change, but it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, and there were going to be a lot of people, inside the department and out, who were going to try to stop her. But Johnson didn't back down. She knew that if she was going to make a real difference, she had to push forward, no matter how tough it got. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Her leadership was starting to have a real impact. Policies were being revised, training was being restructured, and officers were being held accountable for their actions. But the change didn't stop with the department. The community began to see that it wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about ensuring that the next generation of police officers would be held to a higher standard. It was about ensuring that the public could trust their law enforcement, to treat them with fairness and respect. As the investigation continued, people began to notice a shift. The department was no longer the same place it had been before Johnson's bold stand. The leadership in the department had begun to realize the importance of accountability, and Chief Johnson's influence had made that clear. Officers were being trained differently, with more emphasis on understanding the communities they served and less on asserting dominance. Johnson's rise to power had never been easy, but now she was leading a movement. She had exposed a deep-rooted issue that couldn't be ignored anymore, and while it wasn't going to be easy to fix, the conversation had finally started. The city was beginning to change. People were starting to believe that real reform was possible, but not everyone was on board. As expected, there were those who fought back against the changes. Some in the department were resistant to change, clinging to old attitudes and methods. They felt threatened by the accountability that Chief Johnson was pushing for. They didn't want to confront their own biases or acknowledge that their actions could have caused harm to the people they were sworn to protect. But Chief Johnson remained unshaken. She knew that this would be a battle, and she wasn't afraid to fight it. She had spent her life fighting for what was right, and this was no different. She wasn't just fighting for justice for one woman on the street. She was fighting for every citizen who had ever felt mistreated by the very people meant to serve them. The media continued to cover the story. The public was watching, and they were demanding change. The story was no longer just about Officer Carter or even about Chief Johnson's actions. It was about an entire system that was broken and needed to be fixed. The larger question at the heart of the story was, what happens when we stand up against injustice? Chief Johnson's actions weren't just about taking down one officer. They were about changing the system. She had shown that true leadership doesn't come from the ability to wield power, but from the ability to hold yourself and others accountable for the greater good. She had shown that even in the face of resistance, it was possible to bring about real change. And that was the lesson the community took with them. Change begins with one person, one decision, one moment where you decide to stand up for what is right, no matter the consequences. It's about having the courage to fight for justice, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. In the end, the city was forever changed, not just because of what Chief Johnson had done, but because her bravery had inspired others to take a stand. People were no longer afraid to speak up, no longer willing to stay silent when they saw injustice happening. They knew that they too had the power to make a difference, and that was the lasting impact of Johnson's leadership. Chief Karen Johnson's fight for justice didn't just change the police department, it sparked a movement. The whole city, and even the nation, was now watching. People were starting to understand what it meant to hold officers accountable, and it wasn't just about the punishment. It was about creating a system that served everyone fairly. Johnson's courage to step up when it mattered most had not only exposed the flaws in law enforcement, but also given the community a chance at real, lasting change. But, as we know, change doesn't happen overnight. The journey ahead is still tough, but with every step, the system is starting to heal. And that's what makes Chief Johnson's action so significant. She showed us all that we have the power to make a difference, to push for change when we see injustice, no matter how deep-rooted it may be. So, here's the real question. What are you willing to do to make a difference? In your own life, in your community, in your own way? How will you stand up for what's right? It might not be easy, but it starts with small steps. Comment below if you believe in the power of accountability. Like this video if you stand for justice and fairness for all. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep this conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that inspire change.